Escape from the Dead. How Cowboys Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid fooled the world. In a time when the Wild West was a land of unforgiving rule and harsh frontiers, two men dared to defy all that was known about escape and survival. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, two of the most notorious criminals in American history, created a legend that would span centuries and become one of the greatest mysteries of the West. But how did two men, wanted by the entire nation, manage to escape the clutches of justice and deceive the entire world? The story begins in a forgotten western town where Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid are on the run. The camera zooms in on them, riding at full speed, their horses' hooves pounding the dry, dusty ground. Gunshots echo in the background as local authorities and bounty hunters try, unsuccessfully, to surround them. But the two bandits are no mere fugitives. They are masters of the art of evasion. The scene is tense. Sweat runs down the forehead of Butch, while Sundance, with his lethal marksmanship, keeps his enemies at bay. The chase is relentless, but instead of despair, the two men are determined. They know they can't stay any longer. What seemed like a simple heist, a bank or train robbery, now becomes a grand game of survival. They weren't just criminals. They were visionaries, defying the system, defying death. With each passing moment, the pressure mounts, and the feeling that capture is imminent only makes their escape more daring. However, what many don't know is that Butch and Sundance were just beginning to play the most dangerous game of their lives, the escape to a destiny no one could imagine. With authorities getting closer and closer, the plan Butch begins to form. He knew that to escape such relentless pursuit, he would need to go beyond the limits of what any criminal would do. Staying in the United States was unthinkable. They would need to disappear, and truly disappear. The only viable option? Flee abroad. In a move that no one could have foreseen, the two bandits venture far from the borders of Texas, crossing the deserts and heading towards Bolivia, a place where the American authorities would have little or no influence. Butch and Sundance, the escape was not just about escaping the law, but about creating a new identity, a new life where they could be masters of their destiny. The journey would not be easy. Crossing the desert and the vast territory, far from the eyes of the bounty hunters, was a constant battle. Each day seemed like an eternity, but the destination that awaited them was further away than ever. When they finally arrive in Bolivia, Butch and Sundance, they try to get back on their feet. They find new jobs, new identities, and even arrange a quieter life, far from bullets and persecution. But even there, the shadow of the past follows them. They know that, at any moment, their lives could fall apart. And of course, the past never stays behind. Soon, the Bolivian authorities begin to close in. The persecution reaches Bolivia, and no matter how hard they try to escape once again, fate seems to be relentless. A confrontation with the Bolivian army is inevitable. But Butch and Sundance, they are not ordinary men, and their bold spirit never lets itself be discouraged. The question that remains to this day is, what really happened to them? The official version is that both died during the shooting, but many believe that this was just another tall tale created to keep the legend alive. Some say that Butch and Sundance managed to escape once again, disappearing forever, far from everything and everyone. The most impressive thing about this story is not just the audacity of Butch and Sundance, but the fact that the world still asks itself, did they get it? What would it take to fool an entire nation's justice system and still leave doubts about its fate? They became more than just bandits. They became icons, symbols of rebellion and intelligence. Every step they took, every plan they devised, was an attempt to redefine what is possible when you challenge the impossible. their story still lives on. No matter how much time has passed, the legend of Butch Cassidy Sundance Kid remains immortal, as a symbol of courage, ingenuity, and above all, the power to deceive even the whole world. Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, it wasn't just two men who became legends of the Old West. They represented something much bigger, an era of daring, courage, and survival in an unforgiving world. Butch Cassidy, whose real name was Robert Leroy Parker, was born in 1866 into a Utah ranching family. From a young age, he showed a knack for crime, robbing cattle and then banks. But unlike other criminals of the time, Butch was no ordinary bandit. He possessed an impressive strategic intelligence, which made him a master of escape and evasion. Butch was, in fact, the brain behind the plans, always calculating each move with precision. Beside him was Sundance Kid, whose real name was Harry Altham Longabore, an equally skilled man, but with one characteristic that set him apart: his exceptional skill with weapons. He was known as one of the best marksmen of his time, capable of hitting targets with deadly accuracy at impressive distances. Sundance was the man of action, the doer, while Butch was the strategist, the leader. Together they formed an unbeatable duo with a unique chemistry that made them invincible. They were more than partners in crime. They were brothers in arms, united not only by money, but by unwavering friendship and loyalty. Their reputation, Butch and Sundance, spread rapidly throughout the Wild West, making them feared and at the same time admired figures. Despite their criminal ways, they also had a rare ability to connect with the people. They were often seen as the Robin Hoods of the West, taking from the rich to give to the poor, or at least to enrich themselves. Butch and Sundance, they became charismatic figures, admired not only for their courage, but for the way they challenged the system and the law in a time of oppression and injustice. But what made them even more fascinating was the fact that behind all their bravery and cunning, there was a bigger plan. These weren't just random criminals, they were visionaries who wanted more than just a simple life of crime. What began as a series of daring heists soon turned into a getaway movement, a plan to disappear from the authorities' radar and create a new life in a place where no one would find them. What makes them even more mysterious is the fact that, to this day, there is a lingering doubt about their ultimate fate. Did they really die in Bolivia, or did they manage to escape and live out the rest of their lives in secret? Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, they left more than one trail of crimes. They left a legacy of resistance, courage, and above all, the constant fight against capture that, in the end, made them immortal. Their story is one of the most extraordinary in the history of the Old West. They weren't just outlaws, they were legends. When we talk about Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, it is impossible not to mention their legendary robberies that made them immortal figures of the Old West. Although many see these two as simple criminals, the truth is that their heists were well planned, ingenious, and executed with a skill that few could match. The big hit that would turn them both into legends happened at a time when trains were the heart of the American economy. Butch knew that trains were the key to his fortune. He and his partner, Sundance, became experts in train robbery, one of the most profitable forms of crime at the time. They developed a sophisticated technique for stealing the loads of gold and money that were transported from one side of the country to the other. But train robbery. Rio Grande Western was one of the biggest and most audacious achievements they made. During this assault, Butch and Sundance used all their skill to plan and execute the heist with frightening precision. The action took place in broad daylight, But the two bandits used their dexterity to infiltrate without being noticed. They blocked the tracks, stopping the train and forcing the drivers to stop, before disembarking and beginning the robbery. Sundance, with his deadly precision, took care of the guards and others who might try to interrupt the operation. Within minutes, the train was robbed, and Butch and Sundance fled with a large sum of money and gold. But what really marked this coup was its impeccable execution. No bloodshed, no major confrontations, and the ability to escape without leaving a trace. Their greatest audacity lay not only in robbing the train, but in what they did afterward. Instead of following a common escape route, they fanned out across the mountains, using the vast western lands as their hiding place. Although there was a huge reward for their capture, their ability to disappear into the mountains and blend in with their surroundings was one of their greatest tricks. The coup was so successful that Butch and Sundance became legendary figures, idolized by many and hunted by others. But most impressive was their confidence in their own ability. While most criminals would settle for a simple hit and flee abroad, Butch and Sundance, they always looked for something bigger, a way to escape without leaving any trace, like ghosts in the shadows of the Wild West. Their great coup was not just to rob the train. It was to do it in such a way that the whole world could never catch up with them. And so, once again, Butch and Sundance defied the law, and once again, the Old West witnessed the beginning of a legend that would change the course of bandit history forever. But this great heist was not the end of their journey. It was only the beginning of an even more audacious plan, one that the world would never forget. After the big hit that shook the Wild West, the life of Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid would never be the same again. The success of their robberies and the way they escaped justice turned them into fugitives wanted throughout practically the entire American territory. The reward for their capture grew every day, and with that, the pressure on them increased exponentially. Local authorities, including the ruthless Texas Rangers and bounty hunters, were willing to go to any lengths to capture the two bandits. And it wasn't just the police and authorities who were after them. The fear and hatred that Butch and Sundance caused spread throughout the country. While some saw them as heroes of the people, defying an unjust system, others saw them as villains who must be eliminated at any cost. In each city they passed through, the two bandits were forced to live in hiding. With each new location, a new threat emerged, and the climate of tension was palpable. Stealthy, always ready to change their identity, they blended in with the local population, changing their appearance and even altering their escape methods so as not to be recognized. But no matter how hard they tried to go unnoticed, the shadow of persecution was always behind them. Butch, the mastermind behind the duo, felt the weight of this chase. He knew that with every step they took, capture became more imminent. But what really set them apart from other criminals was their cunning and courage in the face of danger. Not only were they evading the authorities, they were also playing a mind game with them. While many criminals despaired, they were calculating every move. Already Sundance, the man of action, found himself increasingly distant from the cowboy life he once knew. With his face constantly marked by tension, he no longer knew who to trust. But with Butch, he knew that their loyalty and friendship were all that mattered. Together they became unbeatable, with an escape strategy that kept them always one step ahead of their pursuers. Meanwhile, the pressure began to affect even their relationship. The constant escapes and the need to always be on the move made life more difficult. The idea of living like ghosts, always on the run, began to weigh on them. Butch and Sundance were beginning to realize that, although they were masters of evasion, what awaited them in the future was an uncertain and dangerous fate. The panic and toe anxiety, the fear of knowing that they could no longer trust anyone, grew as more enemies formed around them. Mental and physical fatigue began to weigh on them, but the feeling that capture was only a matter of time drove them to continue, to live for the next blow, for the next escape. The pressure was mounting with every moment. They knew that in the Old West there was no escape for legendary outlaws. But as always, Butch and Sundance would not give in. They would face this pressure until the end. And so, with each chase, each trap set by the authorities, the path to the most daring escape of all seemed further away. But Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, they weren't ready to give up. They still had one last plan, something even bigger than anything they had done so far. An impossible escape was about to happen. As the pressure mounted and the bounty hunters got closer and closer, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, they knew that the only way to survive was to escape the borders of the United States, where they could disappear without a trace. But escape was no simple task. They needed more than just a new hiding place. They needed a bold plan, a move so bold that the authorities would never be able to catch them. The escape plan hat. Butch, the plan he had planned, began to take shape quietly, out of earshot. He knew that the only way to escape completely would be to cross the border, to flee to a country where the American authorities would have no power over them. Bolivia, with its remote border and sparse police presence, seemed like the ideal destination. Besides, Butch knew that there they could start their lives over again, far from the constant persecution that haunted them. Although Butch, he was not acting on impulse. He knew that crossing the desert and crossing continents would not be easy, and that one false move could ruin everything. He remained cautious, making his movements almost invisible. He and Sundance, they began to prepare for the trip with military precision, avoiding any kind of detection. With each new city they visited, their identities changed. New clothes, new names, and most importantly, new escape routes. Sundance, being the man of action, was more suspicious. He knew that this escape would not be simple, and that if something went wrong, death could be imminent. But despite his fear, he fully trusted Butch. The friendship and loyalty they shared were stronger than any external threat. Together, they knew they had a chance to disappear over the horizon, but they needed to act with extreme caution and speed. The plan of Butch was more than just a physical escape. He was thinking strategically, as always. They not only needed to get out of the United States, they needed to do it in a way that would ensure that the authorities would never discover where they were headed. If the authorities knew about Bolivia, they might send a team after them. But if the escape was well planned, no one would ever be able to trace their tracks. With the plan in progress, Butch and Sundance, they began to move further and further away from the areas that had been their home, always seeking the most remote places in the West to avoid any kind of identification. They used the vastness of the desert to their advantage, blending in with the natives and other outsiders to throw off the hunters. This moment was crucial for both of them. A final move. A move that could guarantee their freedom for the rest of their lives. But like every great adventure in the Wild West, the realization of this plan would not be easy. The risk was enormous. Butch, he knew this escape would be difficult, but he was more determined than ever. He didn't want to be just any old outlaw from the history of the West. He wanted to be the man who got away, the man who defeated justice. It wouldn't just be an escape. It would be a reinvention. They would no longer be hunted. They would become ghosts, disappearing into the shadows of the West, forever. So, with the plan carefully outlined, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid were ready to do the impossible, escape the reach of the law and disappear into the horizon of the Wild West, where the only certainty was that their destiny would be written only by themselves. But what awaited them on that trip to Bolivia was still a great mystery, and the greatest challenge of all was about to begin. After months of meticulous planning, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid finally took the first step towards their long-awaited freedom. The crossing to Bolivia represented more than just a physical escape. It was the last chance for reinvention for two men who, until then, had been synonymous with chaos and daring in the Old West. But the road there would not be easy, and the treacherous terrain of the American desert would lie before them like a formidable obstacle. The first stage of the journey was to cross the desert, a vast sea of sand and rocks, where bounty hunters could be behind them at any moment. Butch and Sundance, they knew that if they made any mistake, the authorities would be on them. Therefore, the journey was full of caution and disguises. Each city they passed through, each stopping point, was chosen with precision to ensure that no one would recognize or track them. At the same time, the constant presence of the bounty hunters' surveillance weighed heavily on their shoulders. While Butch kept calm and focused on his plans, Sundance, he was beginning to feel the weight of the journey. The homesickness, the pain of leaving everything behind, and the fear that his escape would fail, began to take its toll on him. With each step closer to the border, the emotional weight of his decision became more real. But the loyalty he had for Butch compelled him to move forward, even in the most difficult moments. The crossing through the fields of Mexico, it was long and exhausting. They had to be careful not to attract attention as they crossed regions with few roads and isolated villages. But the worst was yet to come. The mountains and the immense crossing to Bolivia would be an even greater test of the two fugitives' physical and mental endurance. However, the real challenge was not just crossing the arid lands, but the fact that they were both about to enter an unknown territory where the rules and laws were different. Bolivia represented freedom, but also the risk of a new kind of persecution. Although the Texas Rangers were no longer hot on their trail, bounty hunters and Bolivian police could easily be informed through spies or intermediaries, compromising the freedom they so desired. However, upon arriving in Bolivia, Butch and Sundance, they found a new world. They settled in small towns and blended in with the local population. There, their identities began to be reconstructed. With new clothes, new names, and new behaviors, they were ready for a new life. But the feeling of being a fugitive would not leave them. They began working on everyday activities, gaining the trust of their new neighbors and, in many cases, making friends with the locals. However, the ability to butch deception and his strategic intelligence did not leave them completely vulnerable. He knew that to truly hide, they needed to move even further away from their previous life in the United States. The climate in Bolivia was different, hotter and more muggy. But the biggest challenge was in the minds of Butch and Sundance. The fear of being discovered never left them, and even though they were in a distant territory, the feeling that their past actions would catch up with them was always in the back of their minds. Bolivia was more than a refuge. It was a chance to start over, but the risk of failure was always just around the corner. If Butch and Sundance couldn't build a new life there, their escape would have been in vain. So while Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, as they tried to rebuild their lives in a foreign land, the tension of living as fugitives remained. But what really weighed on them both was not the fear of capture, but rather the constant doubt. Would they really be able to hide forever, or would the justice of the Wild West come for them once again? Life in Bolivia seemed promising for Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid. After crossing the desert and facing the tension of escape, arriving in the new country represented for them a chance to start over. The scenery was completely different from the arid lands and desolate villages of the United States. The Bolivian cities, although simple, offered the anonymity they so sought. Now, instead of bounty hunters, the threat was the constant suspicion of who might recognize their identities. However, it soon became clear to both of them that despite being physically far from direct pursuit by US authorities, Butch and Sundance, they couldn't just let their guard down. Bolivia, with its isolated areas and few authorities, seemed like the perfect hiding place. But at the same time, it posed a new kind of danger: the region's political and social instability. Even though it was a foreign territory, bounty hunters and the possibility of spies working for the US government still lurked in the region. The first attempt to start over seemed promising. They settled in a small town where they could live without great luxuries, but with the relative peace they so longed for. Butch, always attentive to the future, worked as a merchant, while Sundance tried to adapt to everyday life, leaving behind the adrenaline of robberies and escape. They were now just two outsiders trying to find their peace in the heart of an unknown country. But life as fugitives continued to weigh heavily on them. They both knew that even if they managed to gain the trust of their new neighbors, the reality of their situation as fugitives would never be forgotten. Butch, with his strategic skill, was still very aware that they were not out of danger. Even in Bolivia, they could be discovered at any moment. He began to consider other possibilities to escape imminent capture, should the situation become more complicated. Already Sundance, the more impulsive of the two, was beginning to question the psychological cost of the life they were leading. The constant tension, the need to remain hidden, to never be seen or identified, was beginning to affect him more than he cared to admit. He missed the Wild West, the open fields, the hunting. He wondered, sometimes, if this new life was worth it, if the price of escape was not proving too high for his peace of mind. Meanwhile, the lack of news about what was happening in the United States, about the hunt for them, about new investigations, created a sense of growing distrust. They didn't know how far the search for them would go. Butch and Sundance had gone. Were they really out of danger? Or were the authorities preparing a new, more lethal and more advanced siege? The truth was that true freedom was still far away. Even in foreign lands, the ghosts of the past continued to haunt them. Every step outside their home, every stranger on the street, every furtive glance they met with from their neighbors caused the tension to flare up again. They could never allow themselves to relax completely. They were beyond the immediate reach of American justice, but the constant surveillance of their own minds never let them rest. As they navigated their new life, Butch and Sundance knew that the only freedom they could truly have was the freedom they could claim for themselves. But to do that, they had to tempt fate once again. After all, if there was one thing they both knew better than anything else, it was that in the Wild West, the chase never really ends. It just morphs, changing shape but always present, waiting for the right moment to catch the fugitives. Butch and Sundance would need to fight once again to conquer true freedom. After months of adapting to life in Bolivia, Butch Cassidy and Sundance, Kid began to feel that perhaps they had found the perfect refuge. However, the story of the two legendary bandits was far from simple. The stress of living as fugitives, the constant surveillance, and the feeling of always being one step away from being discovered began to weigh more heavily than ever. But what seemed like a calm and isolated restart soon turned into a real threat. What Butch and Sundance, what they didn't know, was that despite being far from the American authorities, the echo of their crimes still reverberated. Bounty hunters, other bandits, and even members of informal groups were looking for them, and the two men knew that at any moment the peace could be shattered. The tension culminates in a confrontation that seemed inevitable. Deep in the Bolivian mountains, the two find themselves in a desperate situation, surrounded by Bolivian government forces who were searching for them, having been warned by someone from the past. This chase was not like the previous ones. They were not just facing the American police or a group of bounty hunters. This time, they were being hunted by an armed and determined Bolivian army, willing to capture them at any cost. The ensuing battle was fierce and uncompromising. Butch and Sundance, they were prepared to fight to the end, but the forces against them were overwhelming. Even with their fighting and flight skills, the number of enemies and the weight of the situation were too much. Bullets began to whiz around them, and the reality that they might not be able to escape set in. But the end of their line was never clear. What happened in that shootout in the Bolivian mountains remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of the Old West. According to contemporary accounts, Butch and Sundance were killed during the fighting, but there were no definitive bodies to confirm their deaths. Some say they died in combat, but there are others who believe that, with their exceptional escape skills, Butch and Sundance, they managed to escape once more, disappearing into the jungles of Bolivia and never being seen again. The uncertainty surrounding the final fate of the two is what makes this part of their story even more fascinating. As much as the official versions talk about their deaths, there is something incomplete in this narrative. There are no answers. There is no evidence. The mystery continues to live on, leaving the legend of Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid without a definitive end. The death, or apparent death, of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid marked the end of an era. But did they really come to an end? Or did they, as always, manage to escape what seemed inevitable? The truth has never been fully revealed. Thus, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid remain icons of resistance, daring, and, above all, mystery. For those who believe in their escape, their story lives on, a legend that defied the impossible. The story of Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid does not end with a simple or clear explanation. The doubt that hangs over the fate of the two immortal bandits is what makes their legend even more fascinating. Although the official versions speak of a final confrontation and their deaths, there are countless theories and mysteries that continue to feed the popular imagination. What really happened to them? The answer, to this day, remains shrouded in a fog of speculation and uncertainty. The official version, according to the most widely accepted accounts, Butch and Sundance died in 1908 in a shootout with the Bolivian army while trying to escape from the authorities. This version is based on testimonies from soldiers and police officers of the time who claim to have found the bodies of the two criminals after the confrontation, but curiously, the bodies were never confirmed as those of Butch and Sundance. There was no clear identification, and some sources claim that the bodies were badly damaged, which raised even more doubts. The escape theory. Some, however, believe that Butch and Sundance managed to escape again. They were known for their ability to disappear without a trace, and many argue that, upon realizing they were surrounded, they managed to use their escape tactics to escape through an alternative route, once again tempting fate. The fact that no bodies were found and that the bandits were never seen in public again feeds this theory. Could they then be the first to escape the impossible? Could they have managed to live a quiet life, far from the eyes of justice? The mystery is too great to be ignored. The reopening of the case. The enigma of the past. The fascination with the history of Butch Cassidy and Sundance. Kid never disappeared. In the following decades, investigations into their fate were reopened, with new expeditions and attempts to find concrete evidence. What emerged from these investigations? On many occasions, fragments of remains were found that could, theoretically, indicate their presence in several remote locations in Bolivia, but nothing conclusive. In 1991, for example, a team of researchers tried to follow the trail of a supposed hiding place of Butch and Sundance, finding traces of an old farm in the region of St. Vincent in Bolivia, which had been associated with the two. Although they found no definitive evidence that Butch and Sundance actually lived there after the shooting, the site has become a point of interest for those who believe their legend may have continued for longer than previously thought. The persistent legend. Today, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid are more than just criminals from the Wild West. They are symbols of resistance, daring, and, of course, mystery. The doubt about what happened to them, whether they died in that shootout or escaped into a secret life, only adds to the myth surrounding their figures. The films, books, and documentaries that perpetuate their stories continue to enchant the public, keeping alive the flame of legend and the search for truth. What happened to them? The myths and mysteries of Butch and Sundance intertwine with the history of the American West, creating a narrative that can never be fully resolved. They may be gone forever, or perhaps, as expected, they have simply disappeared, like ghosts in the desert, leaving behind a story that refuses to die. In the end, the true story of Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid may never be fully known. But perhaps this is what makes his legend all the more powerful. The certainty that, even dead or missing, their names continue to echo through time as symbols of freedom, rebellion, and the indomitable spirit of the Wild West. The story of Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid is more than just a tale of crime in the Old West. Their legacy has transcended the boundaries of time, transforming them from outlaws into immortal cultural icons. Even more than a century later, the impact of their actions and the legend of their escapes continue to resonate, not only as part of the history of the American West, but as symbols of resistance, daring, and the pursuit of freedom at any cost. Butch and Sundance became the personifications of a rebellion that was often viewed with admiration and sometimes with fear. Although their crimes were committed for personal reasons, the way they challenged authority and established systems has made them, in the eyes of many, almost mythological figures. For some people, Butch and Sundance, they were not just bandits, but heroes who fought against an oppressive system, stealing from the rich and challenging the order of society. They represented the idea that sometimes the only way to survive is to defy the norms. The life of Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid inspired countless films, books, and documentaries that kept their stories alive and constantly renewed. The film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, 1969, starring Paul Newman and Robert Redford, is one of the greatest examples of how their story was immortalized. The film not only captures the essence of its characters, but also transforms the narrative of their crimes and escape into a story of friendship, loyalty, and courage. This film became a classic of cinema, creating a romantic and moving image of two fugitives who became icons. In addition to the movies, their story has been widely covered in books, TV series, and even music, keeping the public interested in the details of their lives and mysteries. Their name continues to be synonymous with legend, something that transcends reality, becoming more than just historical figures. They became the definition of the rebellious spirit of the West, someone to whom future generations looked as a representation of the fight for freedom. The greatest legacy of Butch and Sundance, perhaps, is the way they defied the limitations imposed by society. They were not just criminals. They were, in a way, pioneers in the art of escape, showing the world that even the most powerful authorities can be defeated by those willing to fight for freedom. They taught us that, no matter how oppressive the circumstances, there is always a chance to escape, whether physically or symbolically. The impossible escape is, to this day, one of the greatest symbols in the history of Butch and Sundance. Even though we don't know for sure what happened to them, their ability to escape inescapable situations, always on the brink of death and capture, made them examples of resilience in the face of adversity. They were living proof that, in the Old West, freedom was not given. It had to be earned, no matter the cost. The fact that we are never absolutely certain about the final destination of Butch and Sundance only adds to the mystery and fascination surrounding their figures. What really happened in that shootout in Bolivia? Did they die? Or did they manage, once again, to escape fate and live in secret? The uncertainty of their final fates only fuels the myth, making them even more legendary. After all, how Butch and Sundance have proven, sometimes it is the mystery and the unknown that make a story even more powerful and unforgettable. The legend of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid is not just about what they did, but about what they became. They defied the system, they defied death, and somehow they defied even time itself. They were not just outlaws. They were and continue to be symbols of courage, loyalty, and the relentless pursuit of freedom. Thus, the legacy of Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid remains like a flame that never goes out. They are remembered not only for their crimes, but for the way in which, with cunning, courage, and loyalty, they managed to transform a life of banditry into a landmark in American history. Even if their bodies were never found, or the truth about their end was never fully revealed, the legend of the two lives on, becoming an eternal story of resilience, friendship, and adventure in the heart of the Old West.